Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Chatham House. I'm Paul Judge. I chair the North American Advisory Council here. And interestingly, we had one of our meetings this morning. We had a very good turnout. People, many of you will know, like David Manning and George Robertson and James Arbuthnot, because the North American relationship is clearly vital, not only to the world, but also to Chatham House. And the developments of the last few weeks with our new coalition government and the visit by William Hague and the phone call by President Obama all augur very well for that relationship. So tonight we have somebody who knows a great deal about that relationship and about America's position in the world. But just before introducing him, I have to do the Parish Notices, which is turn off your phone, and to tell you that although this is Chatham House, this meeting is on the record. So please do note that. Our speaker tonight obviously is extremely well known in this area, Professor Joseph Nye, University Distinguished Service Professor at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard, a long series of important appointments before that, including being chair of the National Intelligence Council, and also author of several books which have made a real impact. So, Joseph, we're very pleased to welcome you back to Chatham House and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in London, as always, or Britain. I'm spending a little time at Oxford, but it's also a particular pleasure to be back at Chatham House. Long ago, I was a research fellow as a visitor at Chatham House, so I have fond memories of this place. What I'm going to talk about, this issue of is the United States in decline, grows from a book which I've been working on for the past year, and so it's a subset of a larger argument. The book is about the future of power in the 21st century. How's it changing and how is it likely to evolve? And so this piece about the American role is a piece of a larger argument. And in questions and answers, if you want, we can expand to that larger question. But certainly in the current period, there is the conventional wisdom that the United States is in decline, that it's China-century, and so forth. Any of you who happen to have looked at the Financial Times this morning might notice an op-ed that I wrote saying that I've tipped my hand that I don't think it's China-century. But the conventional wisdom of American decline is quite prevalent. Before we analyze it, it's worth noticing that it's not all that new. What's most impressive about theories of American decline is that they come and go. It's like waiting for a coach at a coach stop. I mean, you wait and sooner or later another one comes. For example, in 1950s, when the Soviet Union put up Sputnik, this led to a belief that that was the end of the United States. Khrushchev came to the United States and said, "We're going to bury you." A lot of people believed it. America was in decline. Later in the 70s, when you had the oil crisis, when President Nixon closed the gold window, there was similar. This is the end of American power. It recurs again in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, when you have the transition from an industrial economy to an information-based economy. You have all these Rust Belt cities in the Midwest closing. People say, Japan is burying us, and there was a cycle of decline then. My friend Paul Kennedy, a great British export to the United States, wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And he said that the United States was going the way of Philip II, Spain, and so forth. I wrote a book in 1990 called Bound to Lead, which argued that the United States is likely to be the leading country of the 21st century. I still think I got the answer right, but he got all the royalties. It was, I mean, the wisdom was that decline was there and so forth. What's striking about this, though, is with these cyclical worries about American decline, is that they can often lead to bad policy. In other words, if you look at 1990, the conventional wisdom of the U.S. was in decline. That led to the view that Japan was winning. Senator Tsongas ran for president in 1992 on the slogan, "The Cold War is over and Japan has won," which led in the 92 election the feeling that Japan is the enemy or the threat, which leads to bad policy. Lo and behold, within a decade, we make the absolute opposite mistake. And by 2001, it's a unipolar world. The United States controls the world. The columnist Charles Krauthammer writes a column in 2001 that says that the United States is so strong that it can do whatever it wants and no one else can choose anything but to follow. Well, that led to some pretty disastrous policy, too. And now we're back in 2010 after the financial crisis, with the pendulum swinging back again. The financial crisis started in the U.S. It was the Americans' fault. It dethrones the image of the American financial system and the Wall Street model as being omniscient. And now we have China with the Beijing consensus as an alternative, another cycle of decline. The point of reciting all this is to tell you that don't believe anything you hear that's based on extrapolation from short-run trends. There's a great tendency to take recent things in the news and try to assume that this is the beginning of something long-term. For example, in the financial crisis in 2008, President Medvedev said this is the beginning of the end of U.S. power. And the Far Eastern Economic Review wrote an article that said, "We've just heard the first shifting of the tectonic plates of the transition of power in world politics." Lots of this kind of thing. But if you think hard about it, by reciting this history of decline, you'll see there's much more psychology than reality in this. I mean, it's odd that we have these extremes of anxiety or hubris, and that tells you something about how we see ourselves. It doesn't really tell you how the world is changing. So what I'm trying to do in this book that I'm writing is actually go below that psychology and ask what's happening in reality. I think it's true that in the short term, the financial crisis did have a negative effect on the United States. It damaged America's soft power, its reputation for knowing what it was doing and being competent in international financial markets. It's also saddled us in terms of the stimulus package that we had to use to get out of it, to get back on a growth path. It's left us with a large debt, which we're going to have to accommodate at some point. And there are other British exports to the United States, such as Neil Ferguson, who said we will never be able to do it, America's a new Greece, and so forth. So there are problems that have grown out of the financial crisis. But before we accept all that, it's worth looking at the real economy that underlies the American political system and economic system. And there, if you look at the World Competitiveness Report, which is produced by the World Economic Forum in Davos every year, it's worth noticing that, yes, the Americans lost a place from 2008 to 2009 in the Davos ranking of world economies. It went from number 1 to number 2. Number 1 was Switzerland. China, incidentally, was number 29. And why? Why would this be? Well, really because it still remains an economy with very flexible labor markets, with a high investment in research and development, high investment in higher education. The U.S. spends twice as much per capita on higher education as Europe does. It also is at the forefront of many of the new technologies like Web 2.0 or nanotechnology or biotechnology. In other words, this idea that the U.S. is sort of, falling behind, I'm sorry, on the areas that are most important for the economy of the future. It's simply not the case. And I think the World Economic Forum ranking gives you a good sense of that. In addition to that, there is a question of demography. If you look at much of the developed world, Europe, Russia, Japan, you can see that most demographers project a significant decline in the share of population, in some cases an absolute decline in population, by 2050. The one exception to that rule, the one large exception to that rule, is the United States, where demographers project that in 2050 the United States will retain its same share of world population that it has today. That's of some significance. In other words, the argument that demography is running in your favor is important, and that is because it rests on being a nation of immigrants. The Americans are able to beg, borrow, and steal the brains of the world, and that is extremely important in terms of the future of the United States. So in a sense, I think if one looks at economics, demography, the things below the headlines that have come out of the financial crisis, one can have a degree of optimism, which is what the World Economic Forum ranking represents. Now, I don't mean to say that all is well or that there are no problems. There are clear problems. There are problems with the American educational system below the higher education level. The top part of the system is quite good. The bottom part is very bad. There are problems relating to the debt question I put. It does have to be paid. We have to draw down this debt at some point. Some people think that primary balance may be restored by 2014 or 2015, but then you'll have the longer-term question of how do you pay for Social Security, which is old age pensions, and health care. And there is a commission to look at that now, but we don't know whether it'll be able to find an agreed solution. And that's led some critics and skeptics to say that, well, it's not that the Americans are in decline economically, it's that they're politically deadlocked, and that's the source of decline. So, for example, if you take the journalist James Fallows, a very intelligent journalist who wrote an article in The Atlantic last year, and he had just spent 2 years or more in China, and he tried to assess the balance of U.S. and China, and he said he had no worry after having lived in China and seeing the American economy that China would surpass the United States economically. His worry was that the American political system was in deadlock. And so he said, if we are declining, it's because of political deadlock. But again, one has to be careful. The American political system was invented in the 18th century to make sure that King George couldn't rule us and nobody else could either. I mean, it is deliberately a way of fragmenting power. So it is a very inefficient system, but nonetheless, it works to a point. And The Economist had an interesting series on the problems of the American political system. And I think the most important thing to say about it is that sometimes you look at a problem and you say, there's no solution. Other times you look at a problem and say, in principle, I can think of a solution. So you can imagine things that would make the American political system work better. Whether we'll actually do it or not, I don't know. No one knows. But it's not hopeless in the sense that Fallows and others have tried to portray it. Now, when the National Intelligence Council, which I once chaired some time ago, did its estimate of the world in 2025, it reported that it saw a world in which American power was much diminished. And there are those who say that we're living in what Fareed Zakaria is called, in the title of a book, the post-American world. But I think the problem with this is that it doesn't really capture what the nature is of the transitions of power that are going on today. It tends to, I think, to lead us to focus on the wrong thing. I've used a metaphor to explain this of what I call a three-dimensional chess game, in which if you think on the top board of military power among states, The United States is the world's only superpower with ability to project power globally, and I suspect it'll stay that way for another 20, 30 years. In other words, I don't see China or anybody else overtaking that. But you go to the middle board of economic relations among states, and the world is already multipolar. It has been for decades. Europe is able to act as an economic entity on this level, and Europe, when it acts as an economic entity, is the same scale as the United States. And you have China growing in its role, and Japan still playing a significant role, and so forth. So the middle board of this game is multipolar. You go to the bottom board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments, whether it's transnational terrorism or whether it's climate change or pandemics and so forth. It makes no sense at all to call this multipolar or unipolar. It's chaotically organized. And the only way you can deal with it essentially is in cooperation. This problem of dealing with some of the newest threats we face from this bottom board of the three-dimensional game are not solved by what's happening on the top or the middle board. So the great danger, I think, is that if people in analyzing power and what's happening to America power look only on the top board, they may feel too complacent that the American military will remain dominant. But if you look at all three levels, you realize that it's going to be quite a complex and difficult game, which is going to take a very interesting strategy. Let me go into this a step more for you. One of the chapters in my new book is called Cyber Power, and it rests on a very new dimension of what is happening, which is you can now attack another country without being a state and without crossing a border except through electrons. That's quite new, quite a new dimension of power. And that's not a question of American decline. Every country is vulnerable in that same sense. It's a function of what's happened in information technology over the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. A way to dramatize this for you is to think that in 1970, and from 1970 to the year 2000, over that 30-year period, the costs of computing and communication went down 1,000-fold. That's a very big abstract number. If you make it concrete, think of the following. If the price of an automobile had declined as much as the price of computing power, you could buy a car today for £5. That is dramatic. When the price of something goes down that dramatically, it means the barriers to entry go down. All sorts of players who were previously priced out of the market can now play in the game. So that if, for example, in 1970, you wanted to have instantaneous communication between London, Johannesburg, and Beijing, and adding a couple of other capitals as well, you could do it. This isn't new. But it was very, very expensive. You needed to be a government, a multinational corporation. It took a lot of money. Today, anyone can go into an internet cafe and for, £1 an hour or £2 an hour, can have the capacity that only governments and large multinationals had 40 years ago. Or another example is that when I was in the Carter administration, the United States had the capacity to take a picture of any place on Earth with 1 meter resolution. That was very, very secret. If I told you that, even under Chatham House rules in 1970, I would have been put in jail. But today, what's interesting, and that cost billions of dollars. Today, what's interesting is that anybody can go to Skype, or not to Skype, to Google Earth, or any, just any one of these mapping places, and can get a better resolution photo for free. That means, again, that the barriers to entry are down, and with the barriers to entry down, there are more players in the game. And so when we think about how we're going to deal with the world that we're facing, we have to realize that the traditional ways of thinking about power are not sufficient. We have to think about power shifts in the 21st century in two different ways. One is power transition between countries. I'm going to come to that in more detail in a minute, but that's not terribly new. We've known about that since the Peloponnesian War and so forth. I mean, that's old. But what is new is power diffusion, the other kind of shift in the 21st century, and that's the diffusion of power away from states to non-state actors. And that is something we haven't wrapped our minds around. That's what I said when I talked about being able to attack another state without crossing the border, just sending electrons, not troops, and do damage that might be equivalent to that done by a bombing, and not knowing whether it was done by another state or whether it was done by somebody in the back room of his or her flat. And that we haven't fully come to terms with. There's now a great deal of interest in Washington on the question of cyber power and cybersecurity. I have noticed that this has caught the attention of President Obama, who gave a major speech on it, who's appointed a special coordinator for cybersecurity. The United States has just set up a new command within the Pentagon called Cyber Command. So people are beginning to wrap their minds around the nature of this problem. But it's only beginning. We are, in terms of thinking about cyber community and cyber warfare and cyber power, about where we were in thinking about nuclear weapons in the early 1950s. Those we really hadn't worked through. What does deterrence mean when you don't know where the attack came? If you see the trajectory of a missile from Russia to the United States, or from the Soviet Union to the United States, you have a pretty good idea of where it came from. Whether you retaliate or not and so forth is another question. But what happens when you're in Chicago in February and all of a sudden all the generators go off? All this, what's called SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems, which are computerized, of all the electrical plants stop. And they stop, and the pipes freeze, and everything comes to a halt. Well, if you've been in Chicago in February, this is a lot worse than being in London in February. But the point is, you could do enormous damage by somebody essentially sending electrons to have this effect. We have to then think through, what does it mean to have a defense against this? When we don't know, you can trace back which router this came from and which computer behind that, but it might have been some clever hacker who wanted to create trouble between, let's say, the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, by sending it through a server in Beijing to make it look like it originated in China. We're only beginning to think, what does deterrence mean in a world in which you can't have solid attribution, in which indeed it may be that the attacks or insecurities you're suffering are from non-states, not from states, or a combination of the two. So these are the real questions that we need to think about as we think about the future of power in the 21st century. And some of the anxieties about American decline that follow the pattern of these psychological cycles that I described for you are basically diversions. They take our attention away from the more serious things that we should be thinking about. Now, with that said about power diffusion, there still is a question about power transition, which is the question of relations among states. In other words, if you go back to 3 dimensions, you have to think of the new things coming from this bottom board of transnational relations. You can't forget the top board of military relations or the middle board of economics. We're going to have to learn to think in 3 dimensions and have policies that work in all 3 dimensions at the same time. And the great question there is, what's going to be the role of China? There is a view that China is going to surpass the United States. For example, Goldman Sachs has projected that the Chinese economy will be larger than the American economy by 2027. That may or may not be true. Always be wary of linear projections. There can be surprises in histories and bumps in the road, and China has not overcome some of the political bumps that it may face. But let's just assume, for argument's sake, that everything goes smoothly and the Chinese growth rates remain as they are. Even if China has an aggregate economy the size of the United States in 2030, let's say, that's not the same as being an equivalent economy, because it'll still have a vast problem of underdeveloped parts of China. And in per capita income, China will not be equivalent to the United States until sometime after 2050. And per capita income is probably a better measure, not just of welfare, but more importantly, for my purposes tonight, a better measure of the sophistication of an economy. So the Goldman Sachs type projections, which also always make very great headlines, don't tell you all you need to know. And in that sense, I think what we're going to see is that with the rise of China, which I think it will do well, the great danger, and this is the argument that I made in my editorial or op-ed in the Financial Times today, the great danger is becoming too fearful or too anxious. If you go back to, there's a view of some people now who say China is to the 21st century as the Kaiser's Germany was to the 20th century. It's the rising state which will create the disruptions which will lead to a great cataclysm like World War I. And that is very dangerous. It recalls the wisdom of Thucydides that the cause of the Peloponnesian War was not only the rise in the power of Athens, but the fear it created in Sparta. And Thucydides goes on to say that belief in the probability of a forthcoming war becomes a cause in and of itself. So some of these anxieties about, is China passing the U.S. and so forth, first of all, they're not very well based factually. Kaiser's Germany had surpassed Britain in industrial strength by 1900. As I just demonstrated, China is not going to be the equivalent of the American economy until well past what Goldman Sachs says. But more to the point, the anxiety that goes with this can lead to very bad policy. Just like the psychology of thinking the Americans were in decline in 1990 and on top of the world in 2001 led to some very bad policies. So trying to get an accurate assessment of what power realities will look like is particularly important. And it's in that sense that I think that this current fad about America in decline, the current turn of this cycle, is dangerous. First of all, it takes our eye off the ball of power diffusion that we really have to be thinking about, and many of these transnational issues where we'll have to be cooperating with China, Europe, and others. And secondly, it may create exaggerated fears about China which can feed on themselves. So in that sense, we have to remember something that Franklin Roosevelt said in a different context, but it's still good wisdom, which is we have nothing to fear but fear itself. The dangers of over-dramatizing these power transition fears is that they can lead to self-destructive policies and divert our attention from a set of new challenges from this bottom transnational chessboard, which are where we really should be focusing our attention. So that's what I wanted to say about is America in decline. The short answer to the question of my topic tonight is no. But that's not a sufficient answer. You have to go on and ask, okay, but what is the problem? And there are lots of them. So let me stop there and throw it open for your comments and questions.
Well, Joseph, thank you very much indeed. Firstly, for perfect timing, which is always appreciated by a chairman at one of these events. And then for what you presented to us and reminding us of the history of those who said that America might decline, the military, the economic, the transnational issues, the technology changes that we all have to face with cybersecurity and other things, which I absolutely agree with you is a huge threat. And then rounding off with a comparison with other countries and not least, of course, with China. So thank you very much. We now have the opportunity for questions. If I can just mention the ground rules. This is on the record, as I said before. The good news about that is that if you ask a killer question, it will be recorded against your name rather than being anonymous. If you do ask a question, would like to do so, and I call you, please stand. Please state your name and affiliation, and if you can be more helpful than saying you're a member of Chatham House, that is always appreciated. Remember, it is a question. Brief questions are requested and not statements, please, to keep everything moving. And we do have microphones in the room, so please do wait for the microphone if you're called. So who would like to ask the first question? Gentleman here.
My name is Anis Qadri. I'm a Chatham House member.
And you have a day job.
My question for Professor Nye is, do you think, Professor, that in view of the rise of the Tea Party movement in the U.S. and other similar extremist movements, does it point to a decline of America's intellectual power?
I don't think so. I mean, the press has made a great fuss about the Tea Party. It's not that new. If you go back to the 1960s, you'll find that the rise of the John Birch Society and the effort of the right-wing Republicans to take away the power of the left-wing Republicans represented by Nelson Rockefeller, it represents virtually the same sort of people. The polls have been done that show that these are generally white, middle class, predominantly male, not only male. So it's not that we haven't seen this before. And it's also true that what you're going to see this year is an intense anti-incumbent year because you have 9.9% unemployment. So whether the Tea Party existed or not, there is likely in any off year to be a loss of seats in the House of Representatives of the party that's in power in the White House. And this year it's possible that Obama could lose the House of Representatives. Nobody knows the answer, but it's possible. But to see this without the historical context of the struggles within the Republican Party and also the fact that it's affected by the political cycles means that Tea Party gets a lot of press because reporters need to write about things that are new and exciting. But in a little bit more careful analysis, it's not as new as it first looks. So I don't see it as a sign of decline. I do think it's serious in the sense that right now the degree of partisanship in the American political process makes it very difficult to reach compromises, and this adds to that. But I don't see it as terribly new.
Well, as you all know, in our country we now have a coalition government.
Yeah, maybe you should lend us some.
And of course the Tea Party have just won the Republican nomination in Kentucky, so it's interesting developments. Yes, sir. The gentleman in the second row. Just coming.
Thank you. My name is Turner. Chatham House, of course, but I'm one time a diplomat. There's an article in this week's New Yorker about Obama's attitude towards other countries, which is rather surprising, I think, to an English reader. It suggests that although Obama, of course, believes in democracy and in human rights, they don't loom so large in his attitude towards other countries as it may have done with other of his predecessors. But in fact, he's essentially concerned with the realpolitik. He's concerned with a pragmatic approach towards other countries, which means that he can deal with countries whom he might well disagree with in other respects. I wonder, does this reflect a strength in American international relations and something against the possibility of the U.S. decline?
There's always a tension in American foreign policy between realism and idealism, if you want, the Teddy Roosevelt tradition and the Woodrow Wilson tradition. Ironically, what's interesting is that under George W. Bush, you had a Republican following not Teddy Roosevelt but Woodrow Wilson If you read Bush's second inaugural address in 2005 and didn't know who wrote it, you'd think it was Woodrow Wilson. And Obama has gone back to, I would argue, more of a Teddy Roosevelt type of point. There's always a degree of idealism, but there is more pragmatism and realism in Obama's approach. But sometimes people say, oh, he doesn't care about democracy and human rights. I think that's wrong. I mean, if you ask why did he give a speech in Ghana rather than Nigeria, I think it's because they wanted to reward the idea that democracy has worked in Ghana. If you look at the people that he's put on his White House staff, like my colleague Samantha Power, who wrote an excellent book about genocide, these are people who do care about democracy and human rights. They're just trying to implement it in I think, a more realistic and pragmatic way than his predecessor did.
Yes, of the 28 Muslim Arab states, 3 are democracies: Iran, Palestine, and Lebanon. So that's a lesson, perhaps. Sometimes you get what you wish for. There's a gentleman at the back, and then a gentleman in the third row here, just so the microphones can get there, and then we'll come to you.
Victor Bulmer-Thomas, former director of Chatham House and visiting professor, Florida International University in Miami. One of the biggest chairs that President Obama got in his inauguration speech was when he said America's ready once again to lead the world. But leading the world is something that the United States seems to have been rather unsuccessful at since the end of the first Clinton presidency. The first Clinton presidency was fine, but after that we've seen a series of either failures or absence of leadership. And at the same time, there have been a number of initiatives, which we would have to say are global, which have not involved the United States, and indeed have had the active opposition of the United States, such as the International Criminal Court and the Kyoto Protocol. You didn't say anything about capacity to lead, and to me that seems to be the key to understanding why, for many of us, the United States is indeed in decline. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, again, if one judges, let's say, on the basis of the criminal court, there's clearly a lack of leadership. But if one judges on, let's say, how the recent financial crisis was managed, there was a great deal of leadership. In fact, one of the interesting things would be to compare what Obama did in this financial crisis with what Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s. Many people told Obama, I know this from talking to them, people in his own staff, that there was a 1 in 3 chance that we might, in 2009, go into a 30s type recession. One possibility would have been to do what Roosevelt did, turn to protectionism. Remember, there was a economic conference in London in 1933, which Roosevelt refused to join. And instead, he used beggar thy neighbor protectionism. It was disastrous. Notice that Obama did the opposite. He built on the G8 to create a stronger G20, and he had his fiscal stimulus package, which often meant that American demand was going to spill over and benefit other countries, and he resisted protectionism. Now, people complain that he doesn't have a strong trade policy. That's not too surprising, given 9.9% unemployment. But if you go back to 2009 and you look at the predictions that were made about how much protectionism there was going to be, what's most remarkable is that dog has not barked. There's some protectionism, but nothing near what you saw in the past. I would argue that's leadership. So pick your issue, and you may say, yes, there's leadership, or no, there's not.
I think a gentleman here in the third row, and then there's a couple of people in the front row, if you want to bring a microphone down so they're ready. This gentleman here in the red tie.
Thank you, Chairman. Gordon Wilson, member of the Institute, but also fellow of the Royal United Service Institute, where I've just been privileged to hear you speak earlier this evening, Professor, and a former naval person. I go back to the question to Chairman when I put a question to what was a panel of 4 professors, eminent professors there. The Chairman directed away, but I did actually want to know what America felt about the European Union's change with the policy of the Lisbon Treaty, but also in many ways emasculating selected non-entities, therefore leaving the power of the nation-state rather than in corporate Europe, and the way Europe ought to dovetail EU with NATO, and America's attitude to this. Is it a feeling that Europe doesn't get its act together and therefore maybe now that we're going to the 21st century it's less important? And NATO itself, how important is NATO in America's view of world power and the way they use NATO?
Could you pass the microphone, please, just to the lady? There you are. Thank you. Excellent.
By and large, the argument that some Europeans make is that America is not paying as much attention to Europe. And in some ways, there's truth in that, in the following sense. Europe is not creating the kinds of problems that it created when NATO was formed or the EU was formed. So the lack of attention is hallelujah. We should be so lucky. American attention is lavished very much on the Middle East and Afghanistan, and to some extent on Asia, and particularly China. So in that sense, yes, it doesn't have the same degree of attention. But if you look at where trade flows and where foreign direct investment goes and what values are shared, the U.S. and Europe are really as close as ever. And if you look at the issue of U.S. attitudes toward Europe, I think there's still a view that the European Union, for all the problems that it's had, has been an enormous success. I mean, if you compare Europe today to Europe a half century ago, this is a success story. The interesting question is going to be whether Europe is going to be able to adjust to the problems that have grown out of the euro itself, as opposed to the EU. I think there's some very severe problems there which are going to have to be dealt with. But I think if you notice that the American support has been pro-European. The newspapers report, at least that was in the paper today, that when there were differences between Sarkozy and Merkel, Obama was on the phone persuading to take a European-scale solution. So in that sense, I think the attitudes toward Europe are still supportive. The role of NATO is there's just been a commission that Madeleine Albright has chaired, and that will lead to a new look at NATO strategy. I think there's still a view that NATO is important. NATO is still anchored on Article 5. It's important to provide security for the European countries or the Atlantic countries as a whole. But the question of how do we adjust NATO to deal with things that are out of area, that is still one we're wrestling with. But I don't think there's been a shift of attention, not a devaluation of Europe.
Thank you. Good. The gentleman here at the red tie.
Terence Parker, member of Chatham House. I'm very impressed by your talk, Professor, particularly the common sense that you've expressed regarding the up and down of American decline and expansion. I have one question to do with the defence and military aspects of what you've said. You've pointed out the very sophisticated problems of cyber attack. Going now to the other extreme, to what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment and what went on in Vietnam, where the great power of America was unsophisticatedly beaten by relatively simple things. And we have the IED at the moment, which you couldn't get any more simple than that, really. But that's a serious problem, not only to America, but to the allies that are helping America. Have you anything to say about that end of the spectrum of challenge?
The lessons that we learned in Vietnam, I think, was that trying to control a socially mobilized and nationalistic population is a mistake. We're past the age or the era where you can do that at an acceptable cost. And one of the questions that is now very much on top of the agenda is what do you do with Afghanistan? Because, as you said, an IED is very cheap. A drone is not terribly expensive, but it's a lot more expensive than an IED. My own view on this is that, and I think this is the direction of Obama's policy, is to scale back our objectives. That we're going to have to face the idea that we're not going to create a modern state centered in Kabul, and that we're going to have to ask if it's possible to find various political bargains which prevent and work with neighbors in the region, which means Russia, China, Iran, India, Pakistan, to prevent Afghanistan becoming a instability for the region as a whole. But I don't think that counterinsurgency doctrines are going to allow us to create a modern nation state based on Kabul. And I think if you look at Obama's West Point speech, in which he said that we would build up, but that we were not doing an unlimited build-up, it's quite different from the way that Lyndon Johnson went into Vietnam, adding more and more and more. But we haven't gotten to the point where we've tested that yet. So that's an open question.
Thank you. Lady in the front.
Colleen Graffi, law professor with Pepperdine University and former diplomat, State Department. I was recently at a conference at the London School of Economics for schools of public policy with attendees from all over the world, and the constant theme was basically that America was in decline and pretty much by next week. And you've described how the U.S. has made some bad policy decisions based on looking at short-termism and not longer trends. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about bad policy decisions that can be made by other countries and geopolitically based on a view that America is in decline.
Well, could you pass the microphone about 4 back?
Thank you, Colleen, and I should also tell the audience that you were one of the successful practitioners of American public diplomacy when you were in the State Department. I think it's interesting if you look at the recent experience in China, that I think this is a case where mistaken assessment of power can lead to bad policy. If Deng Xiaoping's advice was keep your light under a basket, in other words, don't try to do too much. There were some Chinese who, because of their success in the economic crisis, came to the conclusion, we're more powerful now and we should be conciliated, we should be given more. And if you look at Obama's initial outreach to China, and then you look at the way China behaved in November and December and January, this was, I think, hubristic on China's part. And this is the argument I make in the op-ed I have in the FT today. I think that when Hu Jintao decided to come to Obama's nuclear security conference in April, it was if you want, that pendulum swinging back to Deng Xiaoping's advice. The great danger is when a country feels that it's gotten so strong it should get conciliated and it pushes, you can make mistakes in policy. So I think in that sense, Chinese have been writing a lot recently about American decline, and some of them believed it, and I think that led some of them to think that Obama should not meet the Dalai Lama and things of that sort, and that just wasn't in the cards.
A gentleman in the blue tie.
Tom Fenton, an American journalist, more or less retired. I'd like to ask you about another type of decline, what some of us see as the decline of news in America, the shrinking coverage of important issues, the dumbing down of the news, the broken business models. Do you see that as an important problem, or is it another passing phenomenon that we worry about too much?
I wish this were cyclical, but alas, I'm afraid it's secular. I think it's a long-run trend. What we're seeing is a serious decline of the major sources of news that we had in the past. I live near Boston. I read the Boston Globe. I used to pick up my Boston Globe. It would be that thick. Today it's a few pages, except for the local news. I mean, I'm talking about the national news. So the major Newsweek, which is like Time, a major source for many people, is suffering. But that's the bad news. It means that essentially the infrastructure which used to support very distinguished foreign correspondents has atrophied. On the other hand, what's replaced it has been an enormous diversification of sources of news on the internet. So if you're sophisticated enough to know what to look for, you can get answers to things about the news that you could never have gotten when you were relying just on the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever. But if you're relying upon the news to be served to you, then there's an awful lot of junk on the internet. And the problem is there's a lot more news available, but there's a lot less editing and a lot less supporting of responsible reporting and foreign correspondence. I regret that, but alas, I'm afraid that is not going to reverse.
The lady in the fourth row here, and then there'll be the gentleman at the back over there.
Listener Levy. I'm a master's student at the London School of Economics. I was wondering, there's much criticism of U.S. policy towards the Middle East in recent years, specifically the failure to get to a viable settlement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How much is that detrimental to the U.S. as its image, and more so to its decline, if any?
Well, I think it is a very real problem. If you look at the testimony of General Petraeus recently saying that failure to settle the Arab-Israeli dispute affects American interests generally, I think that indicates that there is a linkage there. It's not the only factor, but there is some effect. The other thing is that if you look at the American recovery of soft power that occurred with the Obama administration, it's not very strong in much of in countries that matter very much, like Muslim countries like Pakistan or among Palestinians and so forth. In other words, the polls show an increase in the attractiveness of the United States in much of the world, but not in some of the areas that matter most for the question you just raised. The administration has placed a high priority. I mean, Obama has gone out on a limb on the Middle East peace process, but he's got a real problem. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu has made a coalition with the right-wing settlers, which is resistant to any compromise. And on the Palestinian side, you have a split between Palestinian Authority and Hamas, Hamas saying they don't want any agreement anyway. So what do you do when you have a problem, you realize you have a problem, but you have no valuable interlocutor on either side? That's difficult.
All right, yes, gentleman at the back, then in the centre, couple of rows from the back.
Simon Wally, a huge Joseph Nye fan.
Good. That makes
it's a bit more interesting than a member of Chatham House. A question I had was: do you think that U.S. influence or power would dramatically change or be in decline if membership of international institutions, such as the UN Security Council, included powers such as Brazil and India and China, that they were given veto rights? Do you think that would make a dramatic influence on US power?
I don't think it would make a big difference. I actually think it would be a good thing to have Brazil and India on the Security Council. I should point out that the main reason they're not there is not because the U.S. blocked it, it's because China didn't want India on the Security Council. It wasn't. This is a problem. There was a wonderful plan that Kofi Annan received from the high-level commission that he appointed, I think back, was it 2004, Adam, something like that, about ways in which you could add more states to the Security Council. The Americans were lukewarm about it because they were worried about, how did you get action when you had the numbers go up too high? But the Americans didn't have to stop it. It was stopped by the neighbors. Anytime one country was suggested to go on, its rival or its neighbor said no. Ask how the Italians felt about Germany being given a Security Council seat. Ask how the Chinese felt about Japan and India being given a Security Council seat. So, yes, it would be good to implement the plan that Kofi Annan had, because I think the United States is going to need more fora in which to work with other countries to deal with some of these problems, that transnational problems. I don't see this happening anytime soon, and that's why creating new network organizations like the G20 at the leader level is, I think, a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Gentlemen, just a couple of rows, that's it, with your hand up, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Beat. I'm a master's student at King's College. Mr. Nye, you've had a long, distinguished history on dealing with U.S.-Japan relations, East Asia in particular. There's a new government in Japan right now. There seems to be a little bit of a rift between the U.S. and Japan with respect to the alliance. And I think we'll probably learn more and more about it after the Japanese elections in July, but it seems to be a little bit more than just about Okinawa. I was wondering if you could comment on that and give us your analysis on how you think the relationship could unfold.
Well, I think what's happened in Japan is when you replace the Liberal Democratic Party with the Democratic Party of Japan, I think that was healthy for Japanese democracy. Not because I prefer one party to the other, just I think party circulation is a good thing in a democracy. The problem was, however, that the people who came in the DPJ had little experience in government and were also quite divided among themselves about what to do. Among their campaign promises was to remove the Futemna Air Base in Okinawa. And the best thing to have done is to have put this off, just to put it aside. Instead, Prime Minister Hashimoto has let it become a dominant issue, and that's led to its being disproportionately attended to. In other words, it's a second or third rate issue, and yet it's being treated as though it's the first issue. The first issue that is in the U.S.-Japan alliance is if Japan is going to be living next to a North Korea, which is a wildly erratic dictatorship with nuclear weapons, and it's faced with a rising China, which this year is likely to pass Japan as being the second largest economy in the world. What does it want from the Americans? It wants to have reassurance that the alliance is going to be there for a good long time. The alternative for Japan to go nuclear would cost it a lot, not merely in monetary terms, but in terms of the disruption of its neighbors, its relations with its neighbors. So actually, I'm much more optimistic about the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance than the newspapers are, because I treat Futemna, the air base on Okinawa, as a second-order or third-order issue. I just regret the mishandling that has made a second-order issue into a first-order issue.
All right, thank you. Gentleman over here.
My name is Abdullah Hamoud. I'm a journalist contributing to media in both Oman and the UAE. I would like to raise 2 points. One of them is related to the transnational nature of American policy and the fact that American elections are fought on the basis of local issues mainly, but they bring about institutions which legislate and make policy which is far-reaching beyond the United States border. People in many parts of the world feel that they have to lump what comes upon them without contributing to the institution which makes that policy. The second point, if we are talking about the decline of America, if there is a decline in America, would people from the third world create trends of trying to diversify their bets, hedging on other powers just to safeguard their interests?
Thank you. Could you pass it to the gentleman in the blue shirt in front of you? Thank you. I think it'll probably have to be our last question.
To take the questions in reverse order, you already see a number of countries finding diplomatic alignments and strategies to hedge. For example, the so-called BRIC summit, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, is a form of diplomatic hedging. But I don't think one should take it too seriously. It takes 3 developing countries and 1 declining country and lumps them together, which is for convenience useful, but it's not a real realignment in terms of shifts in power. But what you're going to see, I think, is a lot of fluid ad hoc coalitions for a lot of purposes. But it will not simply be, some of it is because people think that the United States is in decline or hedging against that. But some of it simply because there are differences of interest, and it's convenient diplomatically often to work with different sets of states at different times. So I think we'd see that whether there was a belief in decline or not. On your first point, which is a very important point, which is American politics does focus often on domestic issues. That's normal in a democracy. Indeed, it might even be thought of as healthy in a democracy. But its effects often are transnational, as you put it. And then the question is, how can you get American politicians to take more seriously the perspectives from the rest of the world? one of the things, I mean, we talked in answer to an earlier question, we saw that the classical foreign correspondent isn't playing that role as much as in the past. But on the other hand, direct contact through the internet and overseas experience of American students can help to do that. Among the younger generation of Americans, there are quite a number who have spent time overseas in third world countries. And this gives them a very different perspective than if they hadn't. So that may be some silver lining on this cloud of localism that you describe.
I thank you. Indeed, a recent report showing that 56% of young Americans have passports now, which is a huge increase on the past. I think it'll have to be our last question. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, Professor Nye, BJ Wright from McKinsey & Company. You mentioned being able to conceive of ways to improve the U.S. political system, and I'd love to hear, the couple things that you think are most critical, especially given this sort of three-dimensional power chessboard that you propose.
Well, there are lots of things I'd change if you gave me a magic wand, but I'll give you my two favorite ones. One of the problems in the Senate is the set of rules which allow a filibuster, and you don't even have to get up and talk. You just say you're going to filibuster, which essentially means that you require 60 votes for anything. And that's combined with a rule called senatorial holds, where a single senator can object to something and put it on hold, which is it's like the old Polish parliament or something. But this is absolutely crazy way to run a democracy, regardless of whether it's America or another one. So if you ask, are these in the Constitution? Not at all. They are factually are practices that have come up. So in principle, are they changeable? Yes. Will they change? I don't know. I mean, but I can think of an in-principle solution, which is not all that complex, which is to change Senate rules so that you can get somewhat better semblance of majority rule in the Senate. And on the House of Representatives side, what you find is that through redistricting, what happens is that each party protects its own, and that means that what's called gerrymandering, setting up districts which protect your base, is there, which means that when you come to an election, the American public, in terms of public opinion, is like a bell-shaped curve. Most Americans are in the middle. But if you look at the Congress, it's like a camel with two humps. And why is that? It's because if you're a congressman and you know you're going to win the general election because the district has been carved in such a way that your party is going to win the general election, then you make sure that if you're a Democrat, there's no enemy to the left. If you make sure you're a Republican, there's no enemy to the right. And you've just seen that last night in the primary, or yesterday in the primaries in the United States, which is the challenges have come from the fringes or the extremes, and it's because of the way this structure has been set up. So if you ask me what would I do on that, I would set up commissions to structure the congressional districts to be more impartial rather than politically gerrymandered. Again, is that plausible? There's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits it. Is it likely? I don't know. That's politics, but we'll see. Anyway, those are two ideas which I think could make a considerable difference, and they're not all that complex.
Well, thank you. As you know, we have a neutral boundary commission here, but it doesn't always lead to the seats following the votes. Well, thank you. We had 12 questions, which those of you who know these things was very good in 30 minutes. So thank you all for asking brief questions, but much more importantly, Joseph, thank you for your incisive answers. And it was really a tremendous variation of subjects of different countries, different regions of the world, different philosophies, and everything else, and you handled them absolutely brilliantly. So America can't possibly be in decline if the other 300 million are like you. So thank you very much.